The Shearwater Teric, the Shearwater Nerd 2. How do these computers handle in the field? Stay tuned to find out. Hello everyone, thank you once again for joining Global Underwater Explorers right here on our YouTube channel. My name is Nico Lurot, avid GUE diver, avid underwater photographer, and avid scuba diver in general. Now over the course of the last few weeks, months, you may have noticed that we were doing things like unboxing videos. You may have noticed that we did a video about a GUE doubles primer and what the experience is like in Mexico. The link to that is above. I'd like to do something similar to that second video today and tell you what the experience of diving with what I believe to be two great dive computers is. Now, I'm going to start with the Shearwater Teric, because I think the Nerd 2 is going to be a bit more nuanced than the Teric. While I was in Mexico, as you've seen as I just mentioned, we had the opportunity of cavern diving with zero gravity divers. Now, amongst other places, we also were able to dive on Cozumel Island for a few days, which was beautiful, and we were also able to do a few days of photographing and videoing bull sharks, which was at about 20-22 meters. So I'd like to say that this computer had a chance to experience a number of different scenarios. Now, let's start with Cozumel. Now, when we were going out to our dive sites in Cozumel, looked over the side of the boat, water looked very clear. I appreciate that what you see from the surface sometimes can be different to what actually happens underwater, but the water looked clear, the sun was high, we jumped in, guess what? The water was clear. Now, my first fear, I guess you could say, was that is this screen going to be bright enough, considering that it's going to be very, very bright underwater? And the answer to that is a resounding yes. So much so, this computer actually has 3 different brightness settings, low, medium and high. I had it on high and I actually thought, this seems like it's going to be, eating away at the battery. As a side note, I'd actually like to add that the battery life on the Shearwater Teric is quite amazing considering how much we put it to use. And I thought, let me try something out. Let me drop the brightness a bit. And I put it down to medium and I could still see it fine. I put it down to low and that was where maybe it started to get less clear. But you have to appreciate we were in very, very, very clear water and very bright water. Some of the brightest I've ever dived in. And in medium setting, this computer handled like an absolute dream. Now, another feature which I found on this computer which I really, really liked is I'm personally not someone who likes that constant beep, beep, beep of dive computers. And I've been in some parts of the world where there's a lot of divers in the water, and if they've all got a beep 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 going on, it really starts to anger you. Now, the Shearwater Teric does have a vibrate function, and it's something that not only you can set, but it's something you can test before the dive to see if you can feel it through your exposure suit. Now, given that the waters surrounding Cozumel were about 28 degrees, I made and this is just a personal choice, I made the choice to dive in a wetsuit as opposed to a dry suit. Now, some of you are dry suit divers, that's absolutely fine. I'm a dry suit diver as well. For me, it just depends what water I'm diving in. I'm not a go-to dry suit diver and be all to end all. If I'm diving in really, really warm water, I'll dive in a really, really thin exposure suit with little to no weight in case you're worried about weighting and proper buoyancy. I tested it through my exposure suit and I could feel the vibrate fine. Now, what I did is I set it so that it wasn't at my limit, because I don't like diving to my limits. I like to be conservative and be safe. So I set it to a few meters above my limit and quite a few minutes before, my no decompression limit was even hit. Didn't get anywhere near my no decompression limit, but I did get near to what I wanted my maximum depth limit to be, and sure enough, I felt a really good pronounced vibrate with the computer. Now, it should be noted, I am going to do a full review of this dive computer, where I'm going to talk about its different modes, its different settings, its usability, how usable in fact it is. So don't look for that in this video. This is literally just a quick, this is how this computer behaved in this environment video. And in the environment of Cozumel, so in clear water, this computer handled beautifully. Now, The shark dive was a little bit more I think it's going to be a bit more relatable when I talk about the Nerd 2 dive computer in a moment. But I did use the vibrate function again on the shark dive, because as I said, you know, we were diving. For some reason, the dive center we were with, it wasn't zero gravity, but the dive center we were with didn't use nitrox as a given, so we were diving on air, which was not the best. And we weren't able to, obviously by proxy, stay down at that depth for that long, which was a shame. We got nitrox on one of the later dives, which was better, but on that initial dive, we didn't dive with nitrox, which, as I said, was a shame. So given that you basically don't move when you're filming bull sharks, and you have to be very careful of every direction that they're coming in. You've got sharks surrounding you, essentially. We had about 8 or 9 at one point around us. And, you know, you're not consciously going to be looking at your computer every few minutes because danger is around you. These are bull sharks. You're going to be much more careful of where the sharks are coming from. So what I did is I actually set my computer to vibrate every 10 to 12 minutes. So I'd get a reminder, hey, check your no decompression limit, check your air. So that was just a usability that I personally found for it in that scenario. Now let's talk about the cavern diving, and that's where I think the Teric really came into its own. Now, for those of you who have cavern dived or cave dived before, you're going to be able to easily relate to what I'm saying. You've got haloclines. Now, for those of you who don't know, a halocline is when fresh water and salt water mix. Imagine if you were pouring olive oil into water. You know, they're clearly separated, but where they meet, you get a kind of smoky / oily effect. And when you go through said halocline, again, if you know, you know, the visibility goes to hell. Now, if I had my hand there, I could still make out my hand, but it was kind of a visual blob. You know, I couldn't clearly tell the definitions of my hand anymore because the visibility was gone. I could just see, there's my hand, I just can't see the details on it. Now, what was amazing is that this screen, I could see the numbers still on this screen. Now, what I wanted to do, I got so excited by this. As you can see from the footage here, I actually tried to film it, but obviously, physics are what they are. The halocline completely interfered with my camera's lens and shutter, and I couldn't get it to focus because the halocline was disturbing the visibility between the computer and the camera. So unfortunately, I couldn't capture it for obvious reasons. But what I saw, which the camera failed to see, is I could still clearly make out the numbers on this computer. Now, if you've been through a halocline, I'm sure you can relate to how impressive that is. And if you haven't, believe me, it's impressive. It's really impressive. Let's talk now about the Nerd 2. Now, the Shearwater Nerd 2, to, I think, unfairly a lot of people, is labelled as a bit of a gimmick computer. And I don't think that's the case. I think this computer very, very much has its purpose and has its target audience. Now, let me talk once again about the dives in Cozumel and with the sharks and in the caves that I did. So, obviously, as far as the brightness in Cozumel is concerned, you've got protective rims around the Nerd 2 where the screen is here. So, the brightness was never really going to affect me. But now, what I really liked, let me give you a bit of a context story here. I'm a bit of a fish nerd, call me a wannabe ichthyologist, if you will. There's a specific type of fish, which you can see here, called the splendid toadfish. It's endemic to Cozumel Island, and it's at about 26-27 meters. And given that, again, the people who we were diving with were annoyingly diving on normal air, not nitrox, again, another reason, great reason to dive with your people, dive with the people who dive the way you do. This holiday really highlighted that for me, but that's a side note. I didn't have a lot of time to film this toadfish. Now, the underwater photographers out there will be able to relate to what I'm saying. The others, listen up. When you are setting up a shot, you need to monitor a lot of things. First off, you need to get, your lights in the correct position. You need to make sure that you're not damaging the environment around you. I hate it when people put their fins down on the reef to actually get the shot that they need. Just control your buoyancy, something we all believe in at Global Underwater Explorers. You need to do a few test shots because you're never going to get it right the first time. And while doing all this, while breathing, you need to make sure that you're not disturbing your subject, because the worst thing in the world is when you've got everything set up, you're ready to go, and your subject decides to say, nope, you've been around me too long, I don't feel comfy anymore, bye. Now, how does this play a part in that? Well, think about this. When you're at 27, 28, on air, you really don't have long. You've got to do all your shot setting up. You've got to focus on all these things I just said. Be environmentally conscious. Watch out for your subject. It does become quite a lot of things to think about, and it's quite natural to not always, between each thing that you're setting up, go, check my watch, check my computer, check my watch, check my computer. This thing, which sits right there on your hose, made me feel safe. Because what I really loved about the Nerd 2, and I will talk about this more in the review, is that it sits in a way which is completely non-invasive. But I cannot stress this point enough. It's not in front of your face like that. It sits far more down, right here, almost below the eye, so you can still see forward perfectly. It's when you look, tilt your eyelid down, that you can see down into the dive computer. So it's, first off, it's non-invasive, but it is still clearly visible, and you've got your no decompression limit obviously counting down. So when taking a macro shot at depth, it gave me an added element of feeling safe, and for that I have to commend it, because although I was wearing my Teric, I was far more focused on the camera, so it was really reassuring to have this right there. And now we come to talk about the sharks, which I mentioned before. Now, as I said, I had the Teric set to vibrate to remind me to check my no decompression limit, to remind me to check my gas every so often. But this thing, once again, sat right there in front of me, and when I'm turning around to see a shark coming to my left, turning around to see a shark coming to my right, sometimes there's a shark passing overhead and you have to tilt your head backwards, all of these things, easy to follow, easy to keep track of my no decompression limit with this little baby right here. Super, super useful. And I have to say, in quite a, I would say, a stressful environment, to have something that's right there when you're so focused on what's around you, and instead of having to, because you have to restrict your movement when you're diving with bull sharks, so instead of having to do that, all I had to do was literally look down. That was for the added movement, but I just had to look down. And it really again added to my feeling of security and feeling safe underwater. And so now let's talk about the cavern diving. Now, while the Teric for me just was something else for that halocline reason that I mentioned, there was a little detail, a little facet that I think Shearwater have added to the Nerd 2, which isn't just good customer service and good engineering, it's just plain thoughtful. I love it. So I mentioned that on the Teric there are 3 brightness settings, low, medium and high. Now again, if you've dived in a cave or a cavern, you know as well as I do now that the light just gets eaten. You know, you've got little to no natural light coming through, and in some places it's in most places it's actually no natural light coming through. So, you know, you need your torch. I was diving with the Halcyon Focus 2.0, and I had a relatively large camera with me. So there were 2 reasons where the Nerd 2 really came into its own inside the caverns. Firstly, there is a 4th brightness setting on the Nerd 2. Low, medium, high, and cave. There's actually a cave brightness level. Now, of course there's a cave brightness level. It makes so much sense. The last thing you want in a dark environment, especially when the light source is this close to your eye, is to have something really bright in your face. So the fact that there's an actually dedicated cave brightness to the Nerd 2 that obviously is there to make sure that you don't damage your retina, that you don't hurt your eye in the long term. I mean, well done, Shearwater, frankly, because that was one thing I was worried about when I was cycling through. I had it on medium setting because that's the setting I was using in the previous day in the open ocean. And I thought, yeah, wow, this is really bright. Let me turn the brightness down. And I came across this cave mode and it was like, oh, my eye, it's not hurting anymore. Bliss. So that was a great function. And now we come back to the photography element. As I said, I had my Focus 2 in my left hand. I had my dive camera in both hands. Focus 2 was here, obviously. Most of the time, if I wasn't filming, I had the camera away and obviously the Focus 2 in front of me. Now, you have to appreciate that when you've got quite a lot of things going on in your hands, and you're in an environment, as I said at the top, cavern diving was something that was very new to me, and it was one of my live streams, and I'm happy I've done it. But you know, new environment, quite a lot of kit to handle, and the natural position of your hands with the focus there and with the camera there, it wasn't always the easiest to turn my wrist, right hand, turn my wrist and actually look and see what was going on the Teric. Enter the Nerd 2. It was sitting right there in cave mode, and it meant that while being able to film and while being able to light the way, I had my computer right here in front of me, not getting in the way and actually allowing me to read it properly because I wasn't having to turn my wrist. Don't get me wrong, as I mentioned during the halocline example, I was also turning my wrist because I wanted to see how good the Teric was, and it's great. But to have this here right in front of me, once again, we come back to an element of feeling safe, and this little thing, which is unfairly dubbed a gimmick, made me feel safe in every single environment I've just described. So those are my initial thoughts on the Shearwater Teric and the Shearwater Nerd 2. As I mentioned, you will be getting a full review for the Shearwater Teric, as well as a full review for the Shearwater Nerd 2, so be on the lookout for those. So I would love to know, have any of you dived with the Teric or the Nerd 2? What are your thoughts on them? And actually, before we leave, I know that there's going to be people screaming at the camera now, the GWE community, rightfully so, in case you don't know. You're going to be screaming, thinking, hang on, if this little hole here is what fits around your hose, what happens in the situation where you've got an out of gas emergency, and as we do, we donate the long hose, which by proxy would mean if this is on my long hose, I've just lost my dive computer. That is a question, and it's a very good one that I will address in the review, so be on the lookout for that. So for me, Nico Lurot, until next time, I wish you all safe diving if you're able to dive, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video. See you soon.